So I thank the member for the point of order, but we'll move on now, if we can, to the next item of business, which is a statement by John Swinney on the Scottish Government overview of no-deal preparations. And the Deputy First Minister will take questions at the end. I would encourage members who wish to ask a question to press their buttons now. And I call on John Swinney, the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, this statement is being delivered just 23 days away from the possibility of a catastrophic no-deal Brexit. Scottish ministers have always been clear that Scotland did not choose to leave the European Union and that it is wrong to take us out against our will, a view shared by many across this parliamentary chamber. We have also consistently done as much as possible to achieve the least damaging Brexit outcome. This work has been and continues to be made unnecessarily difficult by the approach of the United Kingdom Government. Our offer of compromise, made in December 2016 and repeated since, has been rejected out of hand. The new proposal tabled by the Prime Minister last week is a step backwards from even those of the previous Conservative Government and appears designed to fail. The UK Government has not put forward a realistic plan to secure a deal, but instead it is part of a political tactic to shift the blame onto Ireland and the European Union as a whole. It is making demands of the EU that it knows the EU cannot accept. And we now know the UK Government wants a much more distant relationship in the long term with the European Union, a harder, more damaging Brexit, with previous commitments to remain aligned with EU regulations abandoned. We find ourselves in the position where, while the House of Commons has legislated to prevent a no-deal Brexit, and the UK Government has said to a court that it will send a letter to the European Union requesting that extension, it has also indicated that it will also go out of its way to thwart that process. In short, if the UK Government does not correct its current disastrous course, the UK is at significant risk of crashing out of the EU at the end of this month, and Scotland will be dragged unwillingly with it. As a responsible government here in Scotland, we must do what we can to prepare for the impact of exiting the EU without a deal or a transition period. That is why today the Scottish Government is publishing an overview of our assumptions and mitigation measures and the analysis that underpins our approach to handling the impacts of a no-deal EU exit. Any EU exit will have negative impacts on the economy and living standards. However, the impacts of a no-deal EU exit without a transition period will be particularly severe and should not be underestimated. The document that we've published today is the product of an extensive programme of work across government and with our partners. The First Minister chairs weekly meetings of the Ministerial Group on EU exit readiness, which oversees cross-government activity to prepare and improve readiness for leaving the EU. The Scottish Government is working extremely closely with our resilience partners at national level and locally across Scotland. That work includes Police Scotland and partners through the Multi-Agency Coordination Centre activity. We've also been working closely with local government and the National Health Service, as well as providing advice and support to businesses, individuals and the third sector. Over 200 legislative instruments are needed to make sure that the statute book is ready if we leave without a deal, and the vast majority of those are now in place. A no-deal EU exit at this time of year presents additional challenges. There is an increased risk that as a country, we also need to address concurrent resilience events such as severe weather, which are more common at this time of year than in March at the other occasion of a potential no-deal Brexit. It is important, though, to be clear, there is no amount of preparation that could ever make us ready in any real sense for the needless and significant impact of a no-deal outcome. The Scottish Government report No-Deal Brexit Economic Implications for Scotland set out in February this year that a no-deal exit has the potential to generate a significant economic shock which could tip the Scottish economy into recession. If all other factors remain constant, an increase of 5% in prices could push an additional 130,000 people into poverty in a no-deal EU exit. Even in a scenario under which a free trade agreement with the EU can be secured, our economy will be worse off than it would have been under single market membership. By 2030, our modelling indicates that under a free trade agreement, Scotland's GDP would be around £9 billion lower than if we had stayed in the EU, equivalent to £1,600 per person in Scotland. We are putting in place a range of measures which will help to mitigate the worst effects of a no-deal exit. These include, in the event of increased traffic flows from Northern Ireland and Scotland, we are looking to repurpose the disused port at Stranraer to hold up to 300 HGVs to help deal with any potential disruption. Supporting our food and drink sector by helping SMEs prepare for EU exit. We have plans in place to enable suppliers and public sector caterers to operate more flexibly, and we will continue to support food suppliers with their planning. Providing online information and support on areas of concern to the public, such as the rights of EU citizens after exit. Making available £1.5 million in grants to help small and medium-sized enterprises prepare for EU exit. The Scottish Government has worked with Scottish Enterprise to reinforce the Scotland-wide Prepare for Brexit programme. This includes an information campaign, guidance website and call centre, roadshows and grants. And COSLA, the local government body, is working with a number of enterprise agencies in conjunction with the Scottish Government on how to support businesses as they prepare. Scottish communities are already under pressure. Last year we invested over £1.4 billion to support low-income households, £100 million of which was to mitigate the worst effects of UK government welfare cuts. Tomorrow, we will be publishing an online tool and accompanying report which highlights the areas of greatest vulnerability to EU exit, whether with or without a deal, in Scotland. The analysis, the first of its kind in the UK, tracks various factors which make communities vulnerable to the impacts of exiting the European Union. As a result of this analysis, we are putting in place a plan to establish a £7 million rapid poverty mitigation fund. In the event of a no deal, this fund will be allocated to local authorities so that those people most in need can get support quickly and efficiently. That may be through the Scottish Welfare Fund, discretionary housing payments, or for particular help with food insecurity or fuel poverty. We are also giving the farming community and the crofting community the certainty they need to plan and to invest in their businesses. We have already paid farmers and crofters £327 million of nationally funded basic payment scheme loans on Friday of last week to support them if we leave the European Union on the 31st of October. Marine Scotland will continue to enforce fisheries legislation to ensure stock sustainability, protect the marine environment and comply with our international obligations. Marine Scotland are working with partner agencies and counterparts across the UK to prepare for the range of possible challenges following a no-deal Brexit, and will specifically work with SEPA to protect environment standards through continued application of current regulatory regimes. We are also preparing for the possibility of disorder at sea that goes beyond fisheries offences and which might seriously threaten the safety of marine users. The UK Government is responsible for safety at sea, the enforcement of the UK's borders and defence against any hostile or illegal activity at sea. Marine Scotland will be a responsible partner and work closely with Police Scotland and the UK Government agencies to provide monitoring and support as appropriate. We expect the UK Government to confirm their capacity to respond to any serious incident and how they will work with Scottish partners to deliver on that. A significant proportion of medicines, medical devices and clinical consumables are imported from the European Union, and the risks surrounding this were recently highlighted by the National Audit Office. We have set up a Scottish Medicines Shortage Response Group, which will review evidence and intelligence and recommend action on these issues should they emerge. In our universities and colleges, we have guaranteed the continuation of existing funding arrangements for eligible EU students entering into further or higher education in Scotland up until the 2021 academic year. We continue to discuss with universities, colleges, students and the Scottish Funding Council the impact of Brexit, and the Scottish Funding Council published advice for universities and colleges on the actions that they should take last week. Our partners in Police Scotland are preparing for the potential impacts of a no deal. A flexible resource of 300 public order trained officers has been operational since the beginning of August, ready to deal with any Brexit-related civil contingency issues that may arise. That flexible public order resource is supported by around 60 officers based at the Brexit Coordination Centre in Bilston Glen. We have pledged £17 million to ensure that our police force have the capacity to respond to EU exit-related issues, particularly around ports and borders. Local government is another vital partner in preparing for EU exit. Following discussion with COSLA on local authority requirements, an additional £1.6 million was given by the Scottish Government to councils for EU exit preparation. This is the same proportion of additional resource for no-deal preparations as made available to councils by the Conservative Government in England. And as I have stated already, a further £7 million to support vulnerable people will be immediately available if a no-deal Brexit takes place on October the 31st. The document we have published contains a significant number of further actions. I will not set them out all in this statement, but I would urge all members to familiarise themselves with the relevant detail. I must stress, though, that much of the responsibility for tackling the issues that we identify in our overview today rests with the UK Government. That is not a political statement, it is a fact. The document includes information on the actions we understand the UK Government intends to take. We are, for example, relying on the UK Government to resolve any issues connected to goods crossing the Channel, where the flow of goods is expected to reduce to 40 to 60% of present flow. We will continue to push the UK Government for further action, clarity and information in the event that we are to leave the EU without a deal in place. However, the level of engagement from the UK Government in that respect has been inadequate, and our planning made unnecessarily difficult by the UK Government's failures to engage and share appropriate information. For example, we have not seen any update of the Yellowhammer planning assumptions since we received on the 7th of August those dated the 2nd of August. Today, the UK Government is publishing a new report on no-deal readiness. It presents a complacent and entirely irresponsible attitude towards no-deal. The paper conveys the additional requirements on businesses, long lists of tasks businesses would have to undertake to continue to trade. No wonder HMRC yesterday assessed the cost to business of additional red tape from no deal as £7.5 billion. And no wonder the Institute for Fiscal Studies today said that no deal would push national debt to levels last seen in the 1960s. There are a range of actions that we believe the UK Government must now take in order to further mitigate impacts in Scotland and across the UK. They must put in place plans to ensure that the supplies of essential imports, such as medicines and medical devices, are not disrupted due to border issues. They must also share the information we need on delays and other issues at the border. They must confirm whether arrangements will be in place that avoid additional tariff or non-tariff barriers on exports of food and drink produce with priority countries. They must continue to share data on the continuity of supply of medical supplies and radioisotopes and make sure that regulatory frameworks are in place for their continued supply. They must act to minimise as far as possible the worst effects of an economic shock. They must provide urgent clarification on future immigration policy. They must be able to guarantee financial support to local economies and communities through continued or guaranteed European funding. They must take account of the differences in the separate criminal justice systems in any no-deal planning and tackle the loss of access to key EU law enforcement tools. And they should take action now to support households to manage the increased cost of living and prevent more people falling into poverty. There are significant financial consequences of planning for and responding to a potential no-deal. Of the £98.7 million consequentials from Brexit preparation funding that we have received from the UK Government, we have now committed £98.25 million before the outcome of an EU exit is even determined. The UK Government announced further funding in August, of which Scotland will receive £40 million in consequentials in the spring. However, the costs of EU exit are expected to far exceed the consequentials we have received from the UK Government. The Finance Secretary has requested an additional £52 million from the UK Government's £1 billion operational contingency fund to help us prepare for a no-deal outcome. A portion of this is to support maritime safety and security, where it is clear to this Government that the resources of Marine Scotland, Police Scotland and the Navy will not be sufficient should there be increased activity either around fisheries or illegal activities. This is the minimum requirement for operational activity, but the real cost of a no-deal exit will massively outweigh these, and further funding will be required. Presiding Officer, I have outlined the issues we face, the range of measures that we are already taking and will take if they are required of us, and the resulting costs to the Scottish public purse. Despite the differences in view between ourselves and the UK Government, We remain committed to ensuring effective preparations are in place. However, there is only so much any government could do to tackle the worst impacts of a no-deal Brexit. To even countenance no deal as a realistic prospect has always been illogical and economically reckless. Now, under the Benn Act, it is also illegal. We therefore call on the UK Government to rule out the possibility of a no-deal exit, as is entirely within its gift to do. The UK Government should instead act to secure an extension to the Article 50 negotiating period from the EU to enable a general election. The Scottish Government would support a future vote on EU membership that includes an option to remain in the European Union. There is no doubt that a no-deal outcome would have profound consequences for jobs, investment and living standards across Scotland and the rest of the UK. The UK Government should do the responsible thing and rule it out now.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions. Donald Cameron to be followed by Alex Rowley. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank the Deputy First Minister for advance sight of his statement. From the outset, it is important to state that while preparing for a no-deal outcome is of course right and proper, we on these benches remain committed to leaving the EU with a deal as the best way to avoid a no-deal exit. We continue to believe that securing a deal is best for protecting our economy, and that is where our efforts should be concentrated. Turning to no-deal preparations, which I agree any responsible government should be undertaking, can I ask the Deputy First Minister about medical supplies, which will plainly be a matter of concern to many people across Scotland? The statement he's just given makes reference to a shortage response group and speaks about recommending actions on these issues. But can he give any further specific details about what work the Scottish Government has already carried out to enable the NHS to manage any shortages and ensure continuity of medical supplies?
Cabinet Secretary.
First of all, I really don't think it's that terribly credible for Donald Cameron to say to me that leaving with a deal remains the position of the Conservative Party, either north or south of the border, given the fact that the Prime Minister has constructed a proposition which I think to any reasonable-minded person would look like a proposition designed to fail because it cannot be agreed by the European Union. And then, secondly, because it has now been made expressly clear by Mr Cameron's interim leader in Scotland that the Conservative Party in Scotland would countenance and accept the leaving of the European Union without a deal to enable Brexit to happen. That is a complete volte-face on the Conservative position in Scotland, and it ignores the democratic wishes of the people of Scotland, which the people of Scotland will not forget about the Conservative Party. Indeed. Now, on his substantive question about medical supplies, there has been extensive dialogue between the Cabinet Secretary for Health and the National Health Service in Scotland with many of our suppliers within the medical supply community to enable, first of all, stockpiling of supplies to provide reassurance in the short term. We anticipate that there are, and there has been dialogue with the UK Government on this question as well, we anticipate there are 6 weeks of supplies available as a consequence of stockpiling. But obviously the information I've conveyed to Parliament today of the potential disruption to supply routes cast doubt on whether or not we would be able to sustain that type of position in the medium term. So the purpose of the shortage group is to make sure that we have intelligence and information available to us at the earliest possible opportunity so that we can take the practical action in dialogue with suppliers and with the United Kingdom Government to make sure that we have all medical supplies in place that members of the public will want to be assured about. Because Mr Cameron is correct. This is an issue that will cause unease to members of the public. That's why we want to avoid a no-deal Brexit at any cost.
Alec Rowley to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
Presiding Officer, I would also first thank the Deputy First Minister for early sight of the statement. This statement reaffirms the severe and unnecessary harms that would result from a no-deal Brexit. And I think we can agree who would be held responsible for bringing about such grim consequences, the Tories, including those sitting in this chamber. It has been utterly disingenuous for Tory MPs and MSPs to tell us that they are seeking to agree a deal with the EU when all they have put forward is unworkable solutions. The scale of planning laid out by the Scottish Government today is welcome. However, it is based on a no-deal Brexit going ahead. Given measures have been put in place by the UK Parliament to try and avoid a no-deal, namely the Ben Bill, what is the Scottish Government's most up-to-date legal advice on the scope for a no-deal going ahead? And finally, does the Deputy First Minister agree that the best way to avoid the disastrous outcomes of a no-deal is to bring the country together and get rid of a reckless Tory government and a reckless Prime Minister at Westminster and allow the people to decide between a credible deal and remain?
Deputy First Minister.
President Officer, let me agree with Mr Rowley that a no-deal Brexit represents the inflicting of unnecessary harm on individuals in Scotland, and I know Mr Rowley's long-standing, if not lifelong commitment to tackling the issues of poverty in the communities that he represents, and it would be those self-same people that would suffer most acutely as a consequence of a no-deal Brexit. I agree with him that the measures undertaken by the United Kingdom Parliament through the Ben Act should provide the necessary legal protection, and the judgment, Mr Rowley will forgive me if I am not permitted to talk about legal advice, but I will reflect on legal issues of which have been discussed recently. And in Lord Pentland's judgment yesterday in the Court of Session, Lord Pentland, if I can summarise his judgment, made it very clear that, in his view, the Ben Act provided a legal obligation to avoid a no-deal Brexit, and that the Prime Minister had given assurances of the status that he needs to give to the court to assure the court of the good faith in implementing the Ben Act. I do, however, read press reports which suggest that some other person speaking on behalf of the Prime Minister suggests that there are ways round this and there are ways to avoid this. So I think when we're dealing with these matters which affect fundamentally questions of the integrity of the office of the Prime Minister should act within the law and follow the Ben Act. And that would give us all a great deal more reassurance about the conduct we could expect from the Prime Minister. Now, I agree that we should take every step to avoid a no-deal Brexit. I've set out the measures in here where the Government is acting to respond to those circumstances. And I do believe that this is a reckless and damaging Conservative government. Mr Rowley and I may agree on the necessity of the public being able to exercise a choice on these matters. When it comes to exercising that choice, I want the people of Scotland to exercise a choice to protect themselves from reckless Tory governments in the future by deciding on their government for themselves, by being an independent country.
Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, President Officer. Does the Deputy First Minister agree with me that the hospitality and tourism industry is a vital component of both the Stirling area and Scotland's economy? Like me, does the Deputy First Minister have local tourism-related businesses telling him that access to labour from the EU is essential to ensure sustainability of the industry? And can the Deputy First Minister tell me how he thinks a no-deal, chaotic Brexit might affect these businesses who, like the Real Food Cafe in Tyndrum, can have around 70% of their workforce made up of EU citizens?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I have to say to Mr Crawford that my heart sank when I saw at the Conservative conference last week the joy expressed about the ending of free movement of individuals by the Home Secretary. I found it chilling and stomach-churning to see that, because we need to encourage migration into our country. It makes us a better society and it boosts our population, and I agree with Mr Crawford, our tourism businesses rely substantially on many people who have chosen to come to this country and make their future here, I represent many of these people as well. I represent these businesses, and the Real Food Cafe in Tynesholm that Mr Crawford referred to is one example of a business that has substantially prospered because of the contribution of individuals that have come from other countries to be based in this country. So I think the signals just now, the uncertainty, the chaos, is giving a signal to some of these individuals that we need to counter, because we need them to feel welcome, to stay here, to make an economic contribution, and ideally to get to a position where we do not have to suffer the loss of free movement of individuals, because it's an economic and social and moral enhancement of our country.
Patrick Harvey, to be followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you. I also thank the Cabinet Secretary for the advanced copy of the statement. And in similar vein to the previous question, I would like to ask about EU citizens who are already here, whose lives have been subject to such uncertainty and anxiety, and I think, frankly, whose valuable contribution to our society has been demeaned by the UK government and those seeking to end freedom of movement. If no deal at the end of October can be prevented, as of course it should be, their lives will still be facing the prospect of future vulnerability, not least if a subsequent UK election leads to a Conservative Party manifesto whose central mission is to throw those people's lives under a bus in a more brutal no-deal Brexit to come. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell us what the Scottish Government is doing, not only to give information to EU citizens living in Scotland, but to identify their support needs? Because surely the impact of this current situation on their emotional and mental well-being is surely up there with anything that the brutal anti-immigrant hostile environment has inflicted on anyone.
Deputy First Minister.
Mr Harvey raises a very serious issue, and I agree fundamentally with the concerns that he has expressed about how the individuals that have chosen to come to live in our country must be feeling in all of this uncertainty, and the impact on their well-being is an issue of great concern to the Scottish Government. Mr Harvey will be aware that back in April, the Scottish Government launched our Stay in Scotland campaign, which was expressly targeted at those individuals to do a number of things, to encourage them to stay, but also to let them know that they're welcome, and that the government welcomes them. And I know, I see Mr Ruskell sitting beside Mr Harvey. I know that he and Mr Crawford have cooperated on events locally in the Stirling area to encourage and get a message out to EU migrants. I've undertaken meetings of that type in my own constituency with my parliamentary colleague Pete Wishart, to make it clear that individuals who have come from other countries are welcome here. We have also corresponded as ministers. The Health Secretary has, for example, written to members of staff within the health and social care sector who are from other countries, to reassure them of the importance that we attach to their message. So a combination of these measures, I hope, will help to give a signal to those individuals that they are welcome. They have to still navigate their way through the settled status scheme. And one thing which does concern me is the relatively low level of take-up of that scheme since its inception in Scotland. And clearly, the current uncertainty will be having an effect on all of that, but we will have to, and I commit today to making sure that the government puts all energy and industry into making sure that we encourage individuals to take part in that scheme. And fundamentally, the answer to this question, of course, is to have an immigration system that's actually appropriate to Scotland. And the immigration system that's been talked about by the Home Secretary is frankly hopeless and counterproductive for Scotland, and we want to have nothing to do with it.
Emma Harper, to be followed by Alice Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary has responded to a question about medical supplies. Many anti-seizure medicines and insulin, which is required to be refrigerated, has a short shelf life and isn't made in the UK, and I register my interest as a person with type 1 diabetes. Can the Cabinet Secretary clarify that the Scottish Government is doing everything it can to support those people in need of vital, life-saving medicines as Scotland is forced to leave the European Union?
Deputy First Minister.
These, the medicines of the type that referred to by Emma Harper are part of the what's defined as Category 1 goods, which will have priority in transportation across the short straits at Dover, where, as I said in my statement, we expect, or the United Kingdom Government expects, capacity to be 40 to 60% of existing capacity. So obviously, in a situation where capacity is diminished, greater priority will be given to essential medical supplies that fall into the Category 1 condition. And so I hope that is some assurance to Emma Harper. But we shouldn't easily dismiss that loss of transportation capacity, because there will be an effect on items that many individuals in our society believe to be essential. And once a prioritisation exercise is undertaken, not all of the essential goods that people would expect to see in our country will be able to reach here. Although I do assure her that the work that we take forward under the medicine shortage analysis within the Scottish Government will identify any concerns about the issues that have been raised by Emma Harper, and the Government will do all that it can to address those issues in dialogue with the UK Government and suppliers.
Alice Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is no Brexit deal that is better than the deal that we already enjoy as members of the European Union. No deal will be devastating to all the people across the whole of the United Kingdom. We must do all that we can to stop it. Can the Deputy First Minister tell me the extent to which no deal planning has led to the deprioritisation of other government activity? How much government effort is being consumed? And what areas of other government activity have suffered because of these preparations?
First Minister.
The Government is obviously having to redeploy resources to take account of the planning that has been required in this respect. The staff numbers are a developing number of staff being allocated to these priorities as we get closer to the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. And the finance and costs involved in that are recounted in the paper that I have published today. But these are a significant financial undertaking the Government is having to provide for, and require us to make constant decisions on a daily basis about what work can be taken forward to support these efforts. So that is monitored on a regular basis by the Permanent Secretary. She takes operational decisions in that respect to ensure that all of the needs of government can be met as a consequence of taking all steps we can to deal with a no-deal Brexit.
Thank you. The front benches of all the parties have had a chance to ask an extended question, so I'd ask all the remaining 9 members who wish to ask to keep their questions concise. The answers similarly so. Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, just hours ago, the UK Government published a further no-deal planning document with some further yellowhammer information. And could the Deputy First Minister set out what awareness, if any, the Scottish Government had of this, and when was it informed that such documents were actually being published?
Deputy First Minister.
Late last night, Scottish Government officials were given a copy of the report that the United Kingdom Government is publishing this afternoon, as I understand it. We have taken part in a number of no-deal Brexit planning meetings with the United Kingdom Government. It's been a minority of those meetings that we've taken part in as ministers. I will be taking part in 2 of those meetings in the course of this week, and other ministers, Mr Russell, took part in one of those meetings last week. So we were given, our officials were given a copy of the UK Government's paper late last night, and ministers' comments today have had the benefit of a brief amount of time to consider that paper.
Graham Simpson, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 12 days ago, I asked the First Minister about funding for councils to deal with Brexit, and I said that there were Brexit consequentials of £93 million at that time. May have gone up. Councils have so far received £50,000 each to employ Brexit coordinators, and would be expecting around £7 million extra. The councils in England have just been given all the money they need. Councils in Scotland are having to make business cases. So can I ask the Deputy First Minister whether that approach has changed, and if not, why not?
Deputy First Minister.
It's just It's just laughable for Graham Simpson to come here and say that local authorities in England have been given all the money they need by a Tory government. If he just goes and has a look at what's happened to local authority services in England, he will understand the decimation that's been inflicted on local government in England by the UK government. Now, we've given an allocation to local authorities. I've announced today that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, there will be particular programmes put in place to support local authority expenditure on mitigating poverty. I've just come from a meeting with the leadership of COSLA just before I came down to Parliament today, and we discussed Brexit preparations. I think it's a fair summary to say that the local authority leadership expressed their satisfaction with the partnership work that is going on to take forward this work. We, of course, remain in dialogue with local government about any funding requirements that need to be taken forward. And I assure Mr Simpson that we've got all of those discussions being undertaken on a regular basis, either by myself, Mr Russell or Aileen Campbell, who takes forward these issues.
Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Claire Baker.
Presiding Officer, can the Deputy First Minister confirm if the Scottish Government is having to cover the costs of a no-deal Brexit for Police Scotland, and if so, how much that is? And does the Deputy First Minister agree with me that we in Scotland should not have to pick up the tab for the Tories' Brexit mess?
Deputy First Minister.
President Officer, we've allocated £17 million to Police Scotland to cover the additional arrangements that I set out in my statement, which are to deal with the potential impact on civil contingency matters within Police Scotland. The Chief Constable took operational decisions to establish the EU Brexit capacity back in March. That was stood down, it has been stood back up again and is obviously part of that planning. But the Scottish Government is meeting that cost, but obviously it's an issue we have to wrestle with within the resources that are available to the Scottish Government as a whole.
Claire Baker, to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Presiding Officer, firstly, we should not be facing a new deal. It would be unlawful to leave without a deal on the 31st of October. And secondly, this is Challenge Poverty Week. The work the Scottish Government is doing on no-deal preparedness should not be necessary, but the £7 million Rapid Poverty Mitigation Fund will be spread thin across Scotland. Will this fund be demand-led, and will it be allocated between local authorities, and is it going to be capped at £7 million?
Deputy First Minister.
The first thing I would say to Claire Baker is that I think it is nonsensical when we all know the scale of poverty that exists in our society to wander into a decision of a no-deal Brexit, which all of the analysis tells us will exacerbate poverty as a consequence. If there is ever an example of recklessness and the harshness of the lack of concern of a Conservative government, this is it. Yeah. To actually pile problems on those who are already facing poverty. So I agree with her entirely on that point. In relation to mitigation measures, I've been quite candid with Parliament today, as have my colleagues over a long period of time, that it will be impossible for us to mitigate all of these effects, but we will do all that we can. We've set out the provision of £7 million in the mitigation fund, which will be available should there be a no-deal Brexit. Obviously, in terms of deciding on the allocation and the utilisation of those resources, that will be informed by the analysis that I cited in my statement, which is identifying the areas of the country that are most likely to be severely impacted by a no-deal Brexit, and that will drive the decision-making around the allocations. And of course, we will keep under review all of the sums of money that are relevant and available, and the Finance Secretary is acutely aware of the issues that Claire Baker raises and will want to do whatever he can within the resources available to him to respond to the scale of the challenge that we might face.
Joan McAlpine, to be followed by Alexander Stewart.
Thank you. As a member covering a rural region of Scotland, I'd be interested to know how this government is preparing rural communities and its economy for Brexit, specifically farmers and crofters ahead of the 31st of October.
Cabinet Secretary.
President Officer, the Government took a decision some weeks ago that if we were to be facing the possibility of a no-deal Brexit, we wanted to make sure that we equipped the farming and crofting community with as much protection and support as we possibly could in advance of that happening. So we were very pleased that on last Friday, the first of the payments have been made to the farming and crofting community, with more than £327 million arriving in the bank accounts of 13,450 farmers and crofters, with further payments to be made in the coming weeks. Now, these advanced loans are the single biggest mitigation action the Scottish Government can provide to support farmers and crofters. I'm very pleased that the Rural Economy Secretary has been able to accelerate those payments in dialogue with the Finance Secretary. They are the first payments to be made within the United Kingdom, and they are in the bank accounts of farmers and crofters to give them the opportunity to plan for what will be a very destabilising situation as a consequence of a no-deal Brexit.
Alexander Stewart, to be followed by Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The statement indicates that COSLA is working with a number of enterprise agencies in conjunction with the Scottish Government to support and prepare businesses. Can I ask the Deputy First Minister if he would clarify the measures which are being put in place?
Deputy First Minister.
The measures that are put in place are a combination of the provision of information to assist individual businesses to enable them to understand and accommodate some of the changed environment that they will have to deal with. The document that's been published today by the United Kingdom Government goes into extensive detail of what I think is an enormous set of burdens to add to the business community. I'm horrified by the contents of the document and the burdens that have been passed on to businesses, many of them SMEs. So much of that advice will have to be enhanced given the scale of the burdens that are being added to business by the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. Some of this support relates to direct financial interventions. I know this doesn't always sit comfortably on the Conservative benches, but this is an interventionist government. We believe in acting where we can to support sustainable businesses, but there will be businesses through no fault of their own will be destabilised by a no-deal Brexit, and this government will want to support them as much as we possibly can do, and we will be engaged in dialogue with our local authority partners about how best to do that in different localities around the country.
And Alistair Allen.
The shellfish sector accounts for approximately 90% of the total value of landings in the Western Isles. Presently, shellfish exporters face challenging enough circumstances as it is in delivering via ferry and road to their primary export markets in France and Spain, all while ensuring that the shellfish stay alive on the way. Does the Cabinet Secretary have any information regarding contingency plans that may have been put in place by the UK Government for this sector, and what representations it has made to the UK Government on this point?
Cabinet Secretary.
One of our very specific priorities has been to try to secure for the shellfish sector, and indeed for the fisheries sector in general, is much greater clarity and assurance about the ability to get product to market as timorously as possible. And for some time we have been raising this issue with the United Kingdom Government. We have not got to a specific point of agreement, but I am more hopeful that we can get to a position where the UK Government at last understands the importance and significance of ensuring that priority can be given to ensuring that shellfish produce can be supported to get to the market as quickly as possible. Now, we will obviously keep the sector informed of dialogue as it continues, but I assure Dr Allen that the Scottish Government, in all of our representations to the UK Government, is trying to secure that type of access to the market and to transportation arrangements that will enable his constituents who do valuable and dangerous work to be able to reap the rewards of the activity in which they are involved.
Thank you, and my apologies to James Kelly and Stuart Stevenson, but I'm afraid we're just a little bit pushed for time this afternoon, and that concludes our statement on no-deal preparations. We'll move on shortly to the next item of business.